There isn't a national holiday to commemorate his life, and there's not much chance that he'll ever have a monument dedicated on the National Mall. But there's a strong case that we should know more about him than we do. He was a founding father who, like few others, has left his mark on America's story. Today, you'll meet a man who's brought this extraordinary figure to life for a new generation, 208 years after his death. Who is it? Stay with us. Before I welcome our distinguished guest, here are a few more clues to help bring today's topic into focus. Our subject was a champion of American independence and a member of the Sons of Liberty. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence at age 30. He opposed the institution of slavery and discrimination by race, religion, or gender. He fought for free public education and the humane treatment of prisoners. He was George Washington's Surgeon General, a devout Christian who was also a preeminent physician who believed in science, was a pioneer in the field of mental illness, and founded the American Bible Society. In nearly every scene of America's opening chapter, this man was a central or supporting figure nearly every time. And in the years before they died, on the same day, July 4th, 1826, it was this man who brought friends turned rivals, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, back together. Well, I hope that last bit of history rang familiar and that you've guessed that, of course, the mysterious founder I'm discussing is Dr. Bendren Rush. And my guest, Stephen Fried, is the best-selling author of Rush, Revolution, Madness, and Bendren Rush, the visionary doctor who became a founding father. Stephen, welcome to State of Independence.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Thank you so much. Now, I know you're a Philadelphia guy. You weren't born in Philly, but you're a Philadelphia guy. And what sparked your interest in Bendren Rush?
Well, I was originally found out about Rush because he's considered the founding father of American psychiatry and psychology. But if you ask a psychiatrist or psychologist why that is, they generally don't know. So I learned about him when the American Psychiatric Association had a big anniversary convention in Philadelphia that I covered in the 1990s. And but, you know, look, I live down the street from where America was born, and like a lot of Philadelphians felt that I did not know enough about it. And so I started looking, when I started writing historical biographies about a decade ago, I started looking for characters that might be a way into the Revolutionary period. And I was amazed that Bendren Rush wasn't taken because he actually is, to me, of course, I wrote a book about him, but I mean, one of the most fascinating founders was either friends or frenemies or interesting enemies with everybody who matters in the American Revolution. And he wrote about everything from the pre-revolutionary period through the period when he signed the Declaration of Independence, when he was on the battlefields with Washington troops, and then through the constitutional period during the time when the capital was in Philadelphia for 10 years. And then, as you explained, later in his life, his amazing achievement was his two best friends who were founders, Adams and Jefferson, stopped speaking for years. And Rush felt that if these two had been torn apart by partisanship, I mean, you know, people forget partisanship didn't start
That's right.
5 or 10 years ago in America. It started about 3 weeks after the Constitution was dry.
Right.
And so Rush was in the middle of that, in between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. His close friend Adams was a Federalist. His close friend Jefferson was the leader of the Democratic Republicans. And so Rush was in the middle of this. The election of 1800 was the most partisan, horrible election in American history. And Adams and Jefferson did not communicate for 12 years.
So how does a guy who's got this much gravitas? I mean, you know, he's a serious guy. He's a founder. He's friendly with the other founders. How does he manage? I mean, he's in the background in the paintings and the like, but how does he manage not to become a central figure, a name that's commonly known? I mean, how does that happen? Here's a guy who's friendly with.
He didn't get a musical yet, you know, and we can argue about that. But you know, it's actually by design. Here's what's interesting: the last years of Rush's life, he spent a lot of time in communication with Adams and Jefferson. And they wrote him unbelievably personal letters. And these letters went on for years. There's hundreds of them. It's like a revise of the history of America. It's unbelievably aggressive conversations about all kinds of interesting issues, and also very personal things about people's feeling of religion, about religion and things like that. And when Rush died in 1813, Adams and Jefferson especially were like, please don't let anybody see these letters. We want them back. Rush had also written an autobiography for his kids. And when his kids read it and saw how open it was about his feelings about some of the other founders, he was very critical of some people, very praising of other people. And one of his sons, Richard, was in the government already. He was in the Madison administration. So they were afraid that if Dad's writing got out, they might be hurt by it, especially because Rush had a real frenemy relationship with George Washington. So all his most interesting writings were suppressed by his family. I mean, literally until the 1940s, when the last of the Biddles, who had married into the Rush family, sold off all this stuff at auction. And all of a sudden people realized that Benjamin Rush was this much different character. And his letters were published, an autobiography was published, and then nothing else was done since. So we were really lucky to find all the materials that had been published. We went through the materials of the people who had published them, which were sitting in archives that no one had looked at. And there's also a lot of letters that have been found since. But look, if you read a history book, you're going to see quotes from Benjamin Rush. There's no way to tell the history of the American Revolution without quoting Rush's observation of what Washington was like the night before he crossed the Delaware, because it's the only writing we have.
And what was Washington? What was Washington like the night before he crossed the Delaware? What was Washington's frame of mind?
He describes him as being nervous. He describes him as having little pieces of paper in his hand that say victory or death, which is how we know that that was the watchword for that evening. You know, but the fact that we have that description, that we have an eyewitness description of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, is partly because Rush was a very interesting writer, very accessible writer. I would say as a historian, his handwriting is very good. So you can actually read what he wrote, which does matter. And so, you know, what I found in writing about his life was, one, his life is fascinating. And two, it gives you access to the entire American Revolution from the very beginning. I mean, Rush was part of the group that wrote the treatise that led to the Boston Tea Party, all the way through the writing of the Constitution, through the War of 1812.
Wow. Now, these guys were young. I mean, when the Declaration of Independence was written and signed, how old was Rush? Was he 30?
Well, Rush was just turning 30. Adams and Jefferson were older. He was one of the very youngest, which I think is actually also part of why his telling of the story is interesting, because it's a story of a young guy telling the story about all these people who are going to become the most famous people in our lives and then joining them. So there's something different about the way he tells the story than the way that even Adams and Jefferson and Washington tell the story. But they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s.
So how did he get a seat at the table? I mean, how did this young guy who was just turning 30 get a seat at the table to become a founding father, to become a signer of the Declaration? How does that happen? I mean,
he believed in independence and he was open about it, which is something that people weren't always. He had also early in his career written an open treatise against slavery, which was a really bold thing to do, and he lost about half of his medical practice by doing that. But he was known as somebody who was a politically bold writer. When the first Constitutional Congress came to Philadelphia, he insisted on meeting John Adams, and he and Adams got to know each other. And he gave Adams advice that Adams later admitted was really crucial to the unfolding of the Continental Congress. And then what honestly happened, he was a doctor. He would take care of the Continental Congressmen when they came for the First and Second Continental Congress. Then he edited Common Sense. So Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense because Rush encouraged him to do so. Rush edited it. Rush had it published. That was actually a secret during that time. But then what happened was that lawyer John Dickinson, who was the leader of the Pennsylvania delegation, refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. He thought it was too soon. He wasn't against independence. He just thought it was coming too soon. He left, and Rush was voted into the Pennsylvania delegation, and he got to sign the Declaration. And then because he was a leading doctor, he sort of took over the medical care for the troops and then was on the front lines. I mean, he left Congress in the fall of 1776 to be on the front lines at the Delaware River. That's why he was there when Washington crossed. He was there at the Battle of Trenton. He was there at the Battle of Princeton. He went to Princeton. So imagine going to a battle that's being held on the campus where you had gone to college.
Wow.
and treating patients right, on a field right in front of where you went to school.
We forget how brave these men were because they didn't know that the war was going to be won, that they were going to be able to actually form these United States of America. I mean, at that point, victory certainly didn't look clear or evident. And so they put their own lives on the line. I mean, when Rush is there with Washington, he's not guaranteed that he's going to see tomorrow. None of them are. They don't know if they're going to be killed the next day. They don't know if they're going to, all these battles, Trenton, Princeton, they don't know if they're going to survive. And yet.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's not just the battles. I mean, there's this great scene that we were able to put together with Rush. After the Battle of Brandywine, there were many American soldiers that were taken captive, and the British asked the Americans to send doctors to come treat them. And they sent Rush. And we found in the journal of one of the British doctors his description of what Rush was like as he was taking care of soldiers, and he was like taunting the British. They were saying like, why don't you just stop doing this? If you just stop revolting like this, we'll just act like nothing ever happened. And Rush was like, no, this is done. You guys took this too far, and now we're taking it the whole way. And he was behind enemy lines.
Wow.
Taking care of patients. So Rush was a very bold guy, sometimes got him into trouble. He was very outspoken, both in word and in writing. His writing was very strong. And that's part of why he's so accessible to us today. He wrote for the public about medicine, about politics, about philosophy in a very kind of almost magazine-y way, because he really believed that the ideas that America were being based on needed to be explained to a lot of the people in America. And yet, keep in mind, he grew up in Philadelphia. Philadelphians were pretty split on the revolution. A lot of them were not in favor of independence because Philly was the biggest, most prosperous city in the pre-Union and had the most to lose if there was independence. And in fact, ended up not being the capital after being the center city, of the states before they were united. So Philadelphia was an interesting place. We tend to love-hate Philadelphia, those of us who live here. But I can tell you the founding fathers were the same way. And so Philadelphia becomes a character in this. I feel like as somebody who grew up who spent my adult life in Philadelphia, that people spend way too much time telling the story of the American Revolution through Virginia and Massachusetts. Ignoring the fact that so much of what happened in Philadelphia. Right. And Rush is a great way to see that part of the story too.
Yeah. Now here's a guy. What impresses me about him is his capacity to see his own frailties. Because after the fact, when people write about people, especially after the war has been won and we become the United States of America, everybody becomes somewhat deified, don't they? I mean, people become a legend. And yet here it is, Dr. Bendren Rush has a very real sense of his own frailties. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, interestingly, they all did. If you look at the letters back and forth between Adams and Rush, a number of them are Adams complaining that Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were going to get the credit for everything. And he was it was interesting. As soon as they got rid of a king, what they realized was that America was interested in fame, and that fame was the new royalty. And
wow.
There's a number of letters about this. If we think these ideas are 20th century ideas, they really aren't. But they were looking at, he would say, like, when this story's told, it's going to be that, Benjamin Franklin, took his rod and had electricity go through George Washington, and they won all the wars, and they wrote everything, and they built the country. So Adams was already a little annoyed that he wasn't getting his due. I mean, he gets it now. Yeah. But the history of how these people get their due is also interesting. I mean, it's not all that when they died, they were famous.
Right.
Adams and Jefferson and even Hamilton became more part of this story in the 20th and late 20th century than they would have been before that. Before that, it was sort of a Washington and Franklin world.
Right.
And history since the Second World War has taken a closer look at all these people. Interestingly, they took a closer look at them all through Rush's letters without really taking that closer look at Rush, until we have.
Right.
So, but I think now, if you read this book, you're going to like, okay, this guy was there, all these things. A lot of his writing is stronger than some of the writing that some of these guys did. And if you want to get the complete picture of how this worked, you have to get to know him. If you're interested in medicine, if you're interested in the separation of church and state, if you're interested in public education, if you're interested in prison reform. I mean, the other thing is that Rush wrote on everything. And a number of his writings are considered the first writings in these areas.
What about faith? I mean, all the founding fathers weren't Christians, and some were deists. I mean, there was kind of a mix, I think, in terms of religious faith.
This was, and Rush recognized this in his own life before the Revolution, because Rush was Second Presbyterian, which he felt, as he was building a practice, was the wrong religion to be in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia was Church of England and Quaker. But he also realized that there could be religious prejudice in a new country. The original Pennsylvania Constitution had an oath. You had to swear an oath that you believed in Jesus. And Rush was against this, even though he believed in Jesus. So Rush had to struggle with the fact that some of his friends were very religious. Some of his friends were deists who didn't believe in organized religion, and that America had to be able to have freedom for all those people. And that was not going to be easy. He worked with Jonas Phillips, the Jewish leader of Temple Mikveh Israel. That's how the language about separation of church and state got into the Constitution. But it was something that Rush wrestled with because, in his heart, he was Christian, and he really wanted everybody to be Christian. He wanted everybody to believe what he believed, but he believed more strongly that everybody needed the right to believe what they wanted to believe, and that organized religion should not have a place in politics. And He was very concerned about that, as was Jefferson. These were, in fact, some of the views that they were afraid the letters they wrote about this would come out, because they knew that these were controversial views. But, if you look at Rush, it's like the minute there's independence in America, he starts asking all the big questions, which we still wrestle with because they're such obvious questions. If you don't have a king just telling you what to do, and you don't have a state religion that you have to worship, then democracy is hard. So being a citizen of a republic is challenging, and it's not simple. And Rush was fascinated by how that was going to happen. That's why he invested so much time. He started Dickinson College. He started what became Franklin and Marshall College. He laid out the plan for public schools that became the public school plan for the country, and really tried to deal with these issues.
So where would a guy like Bendren Rush be today, given our where we are politically in this country with the political divide that we have? Where would Bendren Rush be today? He seems to be such a visionary.
It's really interesting. I think it depends on what age you're talking about, because, Benjamin Rush, like a lot of people later in his life, became crankier and a little bit more angry that people weren't following religion when he was not in a policymaking situation. But if you look at Benjamin Rush during the time when he was influencing American policy, what he would say is that the basic challenge in America of faith is that we don't want to legislate faith away, but we don't want to let people tell other people what their faith is supposed to be. And that is the basic challenge of America. And Rush was living through the time when faith and science were formally separating. And he was very conscious of the fact that, there's a big difference between praying to make sure your medicine works and praying instead of taking medicine. Right. And those were the kind of things we still are arguing about this stuff today. But Rush was the first to realize and write about it in America, how important this was. And it's a huge challenge. But, he said that America was always going to struggle balancing science, religion, liberty, and good government. He said that in a talk in 1786. And it's still true, so true today.
Wow. Well, you are a best-selling author, and you're right here in Philadelphia. And I think because of you, we may finally move the needle on Benjamin Rush, certainly from the standpoint of awareness and fame. Not that Benjamin Rush ever desired to have that, but I think thanks to you, we'll know a lot more. I just want to thank you for being here and for talking with us this morning. You have a marvelous gift for words, and we're so honored that you joined us today. Thanks so much, Professor Stevens.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for recognizing Rush's place in all this. Every time somebody does and helps spread the word, it's a good thing.
Thanks so much. We'll be right back.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
And now we're going to talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well, so I'm in my mid-40s,
And
No, you're younger than that.
He did all this stuff in his 30s. You go, how do you get to live a life like Bendren Rush? I mean, a couple things I thought that stood out. I was taking notes. The whole idea that he could keep the confidence of Adams and Jefferson, who are writing these volatile letters and expressing their deep thoughts. I mean, Professor Freed alluded to it. It was everything, their questions about faith, their doubts, their anxieties, their fears about the future, about the country, about each other. And then like a surgeon, he goes in and delicately shuttles the words back and forth to help Adams and Jefferson, discover what they might have forgotten about each other that was the basis for their friendship. So the thing that stood out to me is this guy at 30 had so much discretion and wisdom to be able to keep confidence. That's not something we prize anymore.
Yeah.
As a society, we don't say, hey, one of the most important things about being a good friend is keep secrets.
Yeah.
And don't use them to embarrass or
Well, does this
broadcast.
touch back to what we talk about? I mean, for Christian people, at the end of the day, because people forget who you were anyway in life.
Right.
But what matters to God is that you love Him with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and that you love your neighbor like you love yourself. And so here's this guy who God used. At the age of 30, he ends up being a signer. It wasn't certain that he'd be a signer initially, but but God allows him to be there.
Right.
And this is a guy who's not out to like build his own name and build his own kingdom. He's a physician, and he's just doing the right thing, being led by the Spirit, and God uses him mightily. So he's a ghostwriter to common sense. He has the confidence of Jefferson, the confidence of Adams.
He didn't even fight for for author rights on Common Sense. To be willing to let something that you've written, ideas that are critical to the foundation of the country, to go out without putting your name on it, and insisting that you have the right of being a co-author or a co-publisher on things. That takes an enormous amount of self-awareness.
That's a sweet spirit.
Yeah.
That's a Christian spirit. It's a spirit that's not trying to bring attention to himself or herself, but just doing the right thing because God put you there to be His person in the midst of that. And so, and how brave was this guy?
Oh man, yeah.
I mean, would we make that decision? I mean, if you had a physician's practice. Right. And you had the choice between just doing your practice or getting involved with these rabble-rousers who are writing this Declaration of Independence. He writes this treatise on slavery and talks about, it's not a good thing. It's not good.
It's bad for business.
It's bad for business. He loses business because of it. But he just feels like this is the right thing. God put me here. I follow Christ. Yeah. And I've got to say what's true and right, even if it's not popular. And he does all this stuff and then puts himself in harm's way. I mean, in order to see what George Washington was like before crossing the Delaware, you have to have been there.
Yeah.
And to have been there means that you put your own life at risk.
Yeah.
So what kind of bravery is that?
What he said was interesting, that he said Philadelphia at the time, Professor Freed said Philadelphia was a divided city. And we don't think of Philadelphia as a divided city. We think of it as the birthplace of independence, that if you walk down the street, everybody would say, get the redcoats out of here, and we're all for independence, and let's go down to Independence Hall and celebrate our freedom. But it was because they had so much prosperity, so much wealth, so much success. And I think that is the question today. It is, if we're living in a time of prosperity, sometimes we're willing to make compromises on things like personal integrity or character or who we select as our leaders many times because we're getting the goods.
Right.
So it's a good deal. So why would we want to change that arrangement?
If you're doing great, why do you want to take any chances?
Yeah.
Right? Especially, if it means losing your life as well as your livelihood.
That's right. That's right. So I think what we have found in Bendren Rush is, and what we've been trying to do with this program is identify young statesmen, present-day statesmen, people that exemplify those Bendren Rush virtues of, how do you exhibit humility and sincerity and kindness? How do you act as a principled leader in the age of social media that is demanding that you continually change and get more exciting for the audiences, to hold your audiences, to grow your audience. And then looking to the past to say, were there people that were admirable? Because what we have done with the founding generation is we have found black marks that instruct us very helpfully to say, let's not make those mistakes. They made a bad judgment here. But then we find people like Bendren Rush, whose lives were not in a perpetual state of self-promotion.
Right.
To me, that's the lesson.
Yeah.
That you could actually live a meaningful life, but nobody know about it until 208 years after you are dead.
Yeah. Imagine that.
That is a life worth living to me.
Yeah.
If you're willing to say, it doesn't really matter if somebody ever knows about what I do. I'm going to love my neighbor. I'm going to care for my community. I'm going to seek the peace of the city.
Yeah.
And he did all of this without us knowing until now.
Well, I love what God's Spirit in a person is able to do with their character.
Yeah.
And 208 years after his death, we are still able to clearly see the character of this man. Somebody who obviously had the kind of kindness and gentleness and honesty that both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams would confide in him.
Yeah.
And know that their
I can't
confidence wouldn't
imagine
be
that.
broken. Imagine that you know that your friend is also a friend to somebody who at the moment is your enemy.
Right.
And
Two former presidents.
Two former presidents.
Yeah.
And yet and still you have this man has your confidence.
Right.
You know he's not gonna do anything to betray you.
Right.
He's not gonna what a wonderful character.
Yeah.
And then he uses the information to bring them together.
Yeah.
He doesn't use it to say, well, you know what, I could probably do something with this.
Yeah.
Most people say, well,
This sells papers.
Right. I could make some money with this.
Right.
Or I could maybe get myself to be president too.
Right.
Using what I know. But instead, he uses it to bring them together.
David Brooks writes about the character, the resume virtues. Those are the things that say, I'm good at making money, I can turn you a profit, hire me. And then the eulogy virtues, the things that at the end of your life you want to be known for. Yeah. That's what matters most.
Right. Well, what we do for Christ is what matters.
That's
and
right.
What lasts. And 208 years after his death, it has lasted. His legacy has lasted. So what a blessing, Jeff. What a blessing.
Let's keep spreading the word about him.
Absolutely. Yeah. We will. Well, that's all the time we have for today's program. As always, our aim here at State of Independence is to help you trust God more fully and to love your neighbor like you want to be loved yourself. If you have a moment, please take a minute to send me a message in the comment box at joewatkins.org. I'd love to hear what you thought of today's program, and I'll respond to each one of you. We're always grateful for your comments and thoughts. A special thank you to Stephen Fried for sharing his remarkable gift of storytelling with us and helping us to rediscover an all but forgotten giant of American history. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. Thanks for watching. I just admire Bendren Rush so much.
Yeah.
I just think he was a great American and just a real
And a good
model.
friend to people.
And a good friend to people.
Yeah, I think that's one.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.